Thanks to my warm-up act. Never fails to deliver. So hi everyone, I'm Stephen Bevan. I'm Head of HR Research and Development at the Institute for Employment Studies down in Brighton. We're a sort of weird hybrid organisation, so we're not a think tank, we're not an academic department, we're not a consultancy. We are a charity and we do a mix of applied research on the world of work, and we also do some not-for-profit consultancy, which is an interesting model, because we don't make a profit on it at all. We established in 1969 and we have about 45 staff across a range of disciplines, so organisational psychology, HR, economics, and a few rogue lawyers. And our interest, I suppose, is in evidence-based practice, and we do work for government departments, employers, trade bodies and so on. We're doing a lot of work, as you could imagine, during the last 18 months looking at what the impact of the pandemic has been on sort of the world of work. We provide a sort of regular commentary around what's happening in the wider labour market, because there's a lot of talk about labour flows and vacancies and skill shortages and so on. So we try and look at what the data is actually saying and provide some commentary on that. We also do a lot of work on what's happening in real organisations, in workplaces, and what are the challenges that are being faced there. We're doing a piece of work jointly with Southampton Business School called Work After Lockdown, which started over a year ago now, and that's been tracking organisations and individuals through the pandemic. And if you just Google Work After Lockdown, you'll find the website for the project, and there's a few free reports and webinars and so on you can look out there. Well, we've been sort of trying to track how organisations have been managing, first of all, the transition to working from home, for example, and then the process of transitioning back into whatever the new normal is. But we also do work on a range of other things, so performance management, reward, and so on. Diversity inclusion. Today on our website, you'll see a new report out looking at diversity and inclusion in engineering, which includes the really worrying statistic that at the current rate of recruitment of women into engineering, it will take another 100 years until there's 50-50 men and women in the engineering sector. So slow progress. And loads of work on well-being at work. And we're doing quite a few projects looking at things like cancer at work. We're doing quite a lot of work on obesity and work on things like musculoskeletal health and mental health. I suppose what I'd say to follow on from what Carrie was talking about is that the last 2 years have really intensified the debate about the ability of organisations to change and adapt, and we've seen some really incredible examples of that. There's been an increasing debate about the nature of what we call the psychological contract between an employer and their employees, and of course the ways that the future of work itself will evolve. And as Carrie suggested, you could argue that COVID has been an accelerator of things that were sort of nascent before the pandemic, but which have really taken hold and organisations have had to embrace, partly as a coping strategy to deal with the pandemic, but also because in a sense it opened the door to initiatives that were really just in their infancy. So what I want to do this afternoon is to take a critical look at some of the sort of social and economic and technological forces that are likely to shape the future of work over the next decade or so. And as I do that, what I want to do is assess whether or not the changes that have been forced on us by the pandemic will result in a permanent shift in working patterns, employee preferences, and so on. But also want to take a more sober look, if you like, at the history of the future of work. Because there's been lots of breathy commentary around the future of work for decades, and most of it is wrong. And so I'm going to see whether or not we're closer than we have been historically to being able to foresee what the future is. And so in putting together the thoughts that I'm going to share with you, I've tried to address 3 questions. What are the main drivers of the dynamism which organisations have got to have or to develop post-COVID? A pretty fundamental question about whether or not we're seeing a revolution in the way that we work, or will things revert to some form of normal? And that goes for practices inside organisations, but also the labour market. And I'll be presenting some data to you that suggests that actually, despite all the churn and excitement in the labour market over the last 10 or 20 years, actually things have always tended to revert back to some fairly predictable patterns. And I'll be looking at whether or not that's going to happen this time. And then third, what are the big questions that HR professionals need to answer in response to those drivers and to changing employee expectations? So they're my three questions. And then what I want to do then is to see whether or not there are sort of big factors that are driving organisations' imperative to adapt and to change. And I'm going to focus on four, but I fully recognise that there are several others that also equally have a big effect on the way that organisations are having to respond. So two obvious ones that I can think of are the whole shift towards environmental awareness and sustainability, which is certainly coming up very strongly on the rails as an issue that is preoccupying organisations, and of course diversity and inclusion for all the reasons that Carrie mentioned. So I'm not saying by excluding them from this neat little graph of four things, I'm not saying they're not important, but these are the four that I think I'm going to focus on today. So let's have a look at demographics and health. Try not to overlap too much with what Carrie was saying about well-being at work, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. So what's happening in the sort of world of demographics? I think one of the things that enables us to be reasonably confident about predicting aspects of the workforce is that ageing is just one of those things we can predict. We can predict birth rates and death rates, and we can do the sums, and we can work out, if you do things like change the retirement age, what does the working age population look like over the next 20 or 30 years? Now, it's been quite interesting because up until the pandemic, there were fairly confident predictions that, for example, over 65s in the UK labour market will account for almost 2/3 of employment growth to 2060. We just know that labour market participation rates have been very high amongst older workers and growing. And there's been a big drive by government over the last 20 years to increase participation, and that's largely been more successful. So, for example, retirement is no longer a cliff edge. It's a very porous transition that people make, and about 25% of people unretire within 5 years. So, the way we manage the end of our careers is perhaps something we ought to be looking at in a bit more detail. And we know that 1 in 10 men over 65 and 1 in 20 women over 65 are still working. And so, that part of the labour market has been transformed over the last few years. However, just in the last 18 months, we've seen quite a big shift in that figure, because about 500,000 older workers, people over 50, have come out of the labour market completely. There's been a big decline in labour market participation, and that's largely amongst older women. And the thing we don't know yet is to what extent that will bounce back, or whether it's something permanent. It may be that some occupations and some sectors that employ lots of women are experiencing a permanent shift into economic inactivity, and we're still not clear why that is. So one of the big questions is the progress that we've made in keeping older workers in the labour market has taken a bit of a hit during the recession, during the pandemic and the recession. To what extent is that going to recover, and what can we do about it? And obviously that plays into the wider debate about skill shortages, hard to fill vacancies, discontinuity of labour supply, I suppose, which has been affected by both the pandemic and also in some sectors by Brexit. So there's a bit of uncertainty there still. The other demographic thing we know about is birth rates. Obviously, that's looking a long way ahead in terms of future labour supply, but we know that from a demographic point of view, just very crudely, just to keep the population at a constant level, we need every woman of childbearing age to have 2.1 children. At the moment, it's 1.58. And so that's why, for example, that's part of the thinking behind Angela Merkel actually encouraging more and more migration a few years ago because she recognised that there were going to be demographic problems that would lead to labour shortages. It was 2.93 children per woman in 1964, for example. So birth rates tend to fall as affluence grows, and one of the challenges is that if you look demographically, we're not producing the flow of labour that we're going to need over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Workforce health is a big issue, of course, and Carrie has talked to you very eloquently about some of the challenges. We know that musculoskeletal conditions and mental health problems remain the dominant features of the problem in terms of both sickness absence and presenteeism. The last lot of data, so if you're a data geek like me and you look at sickness absence statistics, we're screwed, because how do we measure sickness absence in a pandemic? In 25 years' time, when we look back on 2020 and 2021, trying to find out what the trends were in sickness absence, they're going to be a big problem in the data. But the most recent data we have on these two health factors are that they account for about 31 million working days lost each year, and that's more than the number of days lost through strike action in 1979 during the winter of discontent. So, you know, the fact that that's happening in what is essentially an aging population is something we need to be wary of, and I'll show you a scary graph about that in a second. And obviously the link between workforce health and productivity, which is, I guess, the main theme of the book, is that labour supply has a big impact on the productive capacity of the workforce, and if it's an unhealthy workforce, that has a multiplying problem. And of course, what's tended to happen with productivity, and I'll talk about that this again in a minute, is that we've tended to think about productivity being a sort of a result of investing in skills and technology. And I think that one of the core arguments of the book is that productive capacity through health in the workforce is a sort of intangible asset that we're not really thinking about in that sense. And we need to do a lot more to make sure that we're thinking about the health of the workforce as a factor of production. So what do we know about the future of the health of the workforce? This is just a number of people in the UK working age population who will have a long-term health condition by 2030. By long-term conditions, we tend to mean symptoms that last more than 3 months. And you can see that mental illness and musculoskeletal conditions account for certainly much more than 50% of the total. And then we have a range of other conditions: asthma, cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, diabetes, coronary heart disease, and stroke. And of course, there are many others, MS, rheumatoid arthritis, and so on. And the key thing is that this represents about 42% of the working age population by 2040. So it's not something that is just a minority of people that you don't really need to worry about, or you can recruit your way around. These are people in the mainstream of the workforce. And also within that, we know that 25 to 30% of people have more than one health condition. So comorbidity is something that we don't tend to take as much notice of as we should. And we know that, for example, the best predictor of early return to work after a period of chronic low back pain is job satisfaction. It's not whether or not you get physiotherapy or an ergonomic chair. It's the quality of leadership in your organisation and whether or not you like your job. So these things are really very complicated, and you can over-medicalise this, and it's really important not to. Last depressing slide: comorbidity and ageing. So as we age, we have an elevated risk of developing more and more disorders as we go along. Now, some of these are going to be work limiting and some of them aren't. But you can see that one of the downsides of our success in having more and more older workers in the workforce is that we end up with more people with chronic health conditions. So the practical implication of that for employers is that they're going to need to get a lot better at prevention, risk assessment, job retention, workplace adjustments and job redesign, vocational rehabilitation, managing return to work. These are sort of core disciplines of occupational medicine, and those of you in larger organisations who have occupational health people, you're going to need more of them to do this, and you're going to need more managers who are aware of and skilled up in the processes of managing the consequences of having a diverse workforce of people who are living with and usually managing very well chronic health conditions that may have an effect on productive capacity. Let's look at this productivity question in a little bit more detail. As Carrie said, we're using productivity, a range of productivity measures. I'm really talking mostly about labour productivity. So technically, that's the amount of output per hour worked, and that's how the Office of National Statistics measure this. And as Carrie correctly said, the UK's performance on labour productivity is pretty poor compared with most of our competitors. And it was only really just as the pandemic hit that the UK productivity was hitting the same levels as it was prior to the global financial crash. So it had recovered very slowly, and then of course it's taken another hit. And of course, we've heard from the Prime Minister that he has an aspiration to have a high wage, high skill, high productivity economy. It's still very unclear what that really means and how you get to it. Because the traditional levers that we've been pulling to drive productivity, as I mentioned earlier, investment in skills and investment in technology, have been actually relatively low levels of investment in both of those for the last 10, 15 years or so, which is sort of why we're arguing that the health of the workforce needs to be looked at in that mix as well. Now, part of the problem is that, as Carrie said, in the service sector economy, few employers measure productivity in a very accurate or reliable or consistent way. Do you put your hand up if you measure productivity in a way that you trust? No. So if you're making cars, or you're making Marmite, or then it's relatively easy to measure the inputs to that as well as the outputs. But actually measuring output per hour worked in a law firm or an investment bank or even in a supermarket is actually quite hard. And one of the real conundrums here is that actually in many sectors of the economy, most organisations aren't really interested in productivity because it's very intangible to them. They're interested in profitability. And what you could argue, and there's some interesting case studies looking at this, that actually the drive for increased profitability can crowd out any efforts to improve productivity. And you can become more profitable by completely ignoring productivity. So it's rational in many sectors for employers to go for relatively inexpensive workers rather than investing in lots of technology to drive up productivity. Because keeping your labour costs low, and particularly if you've got a plentiful supply of workers, which we currently don't have, is a better way of driving short-term success than investing in productivity, which is a bit less tangible. So it is one of the big conundrums of our time, particularly in some sectors. We seem to be stuck in a low-skill, low-pay equilibrium, which means that productivity is something we don't really bother about too much. And that is a real concern if, as we're beginning to see now, that both real wages and productivity have remained pretty stagnant over the last 10, 15 years or so, particularly the last 10 years. And that is a concern if we're really interested in improving living standards and if we want people to thrive. And we don't want people to have problems with financial well-being. And of course, if you overlay that with the issue of higher inflation, then that can be a challenge too. So the whole issue of productivity, the nature of work, well-being at work, what employers do to maximise performance, whether that's productivity or profitability, is really quite important for us to take a bit more notice of. And there's a big question about whether or not that's the job of government to do anything about, to what extent we should look at this at sectoral level. The conventional wisdom was that the UK was poor because it had a very long tail of poor performing companies. John Van Reenen and Nick Bloom of the LSE have been doing a lot of work on this, and they produced a report, the Centre for Economic Performance, as well as the Resolution Foundation, I think early last week, that said that it's not about tackling that long tail of poorly productive companies, it's just investing more in the ones that are doing well already. And that's a sort of quite Darwinistic approach, because what that says is that there's lots of small organisations who are never going to be highly productive, and we should just kill them off or let them die. Which is a very interesting way of thinking about industrial strategy. And and that's something I think that we're yet to really grapple with. And of course, the pandemic has shone a light on this, perhaps in a way that hasn't been done since the financial crash. And I'm very interested to see to what extent the government has a position on this, and whether or not sector bodies like engineering and retail and others actually are taking a more strategic view about this. The other thing that's part of this whole debate is commentary around precarious work. What you tend to find after an economic shock is, as the labour market recovers, more organisations are dipping their toe back into the recruitment market, and they're recruiting people on temporary contracts or more precarious working arrangements because they're not completely certain that the demand is there to justify having people on a full-time or permanent basis. And so there's been this build-up of rhetoric about the UK labour market being characterised mainly by precarity, by people working in highly vulnerable working arrangements, and that's essentially the future. And the future of work in the UK is Deliveroo. And I think it's worth just having a little bit of a think about whether or not that's really true, just by looking at some of the data. So I apologise, I've got a couple of charts here. I don't expect you to look in the detail of them, but the key point is here, I've got just some different dimensions of the UK labour market going back to 1996 and then 2016. And I can update you on where we are now on each of these things, because I just want to challenge this notion that a UK labour market is essentially incredibly fragmented and characterised by job insecurity and precariousness. So just look quickly here, the share of jobs that are permanent is nearly 80%, and it always has been. Back to 2016, that's what it was like. It's still like it now. So we need to really think whether or not the commentary around precarious and flexible work is true. Share of people in full-time work has dropped a tiny bit, but remains broadly the same. Share of people working part-time has actually gone up a little bit. Share of people in self-employment, although it's taken a dip during the last 18 months, it's been climbing a little bit and is relatively stable at 13–14%. Share of temporary jobs, that's actually gone up a little bit in the most recent data, but it's never been above 10%, which might surprise some of you. Share of people in other employment, so that's people on the work schemes and so on, that fluctuates a little bit with unemployment. Share of people with a second job, very topical at the moment, I understand, is currently still about 3.5% of the workforce have a second job. It was much higher in 1996. And the proportion of people on 0 hours contracts, we didn't really know about that in 96, but it was 2.9% in 2016, hasn't gone up very much. There was a recent report by the TUC that suggested it had gone up massively, but actually on careful scrutiny of that report, it hasn't really changed very much at all. And the total proportion of people in the so-called gig economy, if you put all those different types of working arrangements together, is still only about 4%. So I guess the key message is that actually, despite all the shocks we see in the economy and fluctuations in labour demand, labour supply and so on, actually, broadly, the economy goes back to some sort of equilibrium point where we have 80% of people in permanent jobs, about a quarter of people in part-time work, less than 10% in temporary work. And whilst there's fluctuations there, actually, we come back to a situation of some sort of equilibrium. And my guess is that that's going to happen this time. We've been hearing a lot just in the last couple of days about the Great Resignation, for example, that yes, actually, when you look at the data about just between July and September this year, 2.2 million people got new jobs or started new jobs, which sounds like a massive amount of churn. Half of those people were people coming off unemployment and into work, and half of those were people who just switched jobs. But actually, when you compare that against the trends over the last 20 years, it is high, but it's still about as high as it was in September 2007. So it's not unprecedented. I think there's an argument that it's happening a little bit more in the United States at the moment. And most of the frenzy about the Great Resignation are based on surveys done by Microsoft and by McKinsey that predict the number of people who say they're going to quit, which is about 40%. Having done loads of studies on whether or not people's stated intention to quit actually results in quitting, I'd say not worry, don't worry too much. And here's one of my favourite graphs, which is showing how long people stay in their jobs. This is data between 1994 and 2014. What it shows is a remarkable amount of stability. And interestingly, the average employment relationship lasted 8.2 years in 2014, compared with 7.9 years in 1994. So average job tenure has gone up over the last 20 or 30 years. People are more stable in their jobs. The idea that everyone's sort of moving around, having portfolio careers and jumping ship as soon as they can, not borne out by the data. It's clear that in some organisations there is high churn at the bottom end, with people relatively short service and younger people. But in aggregate, there's a huge amount of stability in the labour market, again, despite the shocks. So what this tells us, I suppose, is the labour market is cyclical. All these things, labour flows and so on, are linked to the buoyancy of the labour market. And we should probably accept high churn and periods of high voluntary resignation as part of the landscape. But we shouldn't panic too much. And I just think we need to have a bit more faith in the UK labour market's ability to remain stable or revert back to some of its core characteristics. And I'm not panicking really that the pandemic is going to represent a change that is unprecedented. So lots of stability. I think there's obviously debates about whether or not hybrid working is happening. We know from certainly our work after lockdown studies that between 70 and 80% of people want to work 2 or 3 days at home. And for the most part, they, with their employers, are coming to very grown-up conclusions about how they should organise that. And it's certainly not, at least in my view, something the government needs to have an opinion on, other than for its own employees. We're seeing a growth of ideals, which is essentially a way of having individualised, flexible working arrangements. So rather than saying, we offer a job sharing scheme or we offer compressed hours working, there's much more chat now in organisations about having much more individualised deals. Now that potentially is a nightmare for HR people because of equality and fairness and precedent and so on, but it is something that's happening much more. Precarious work we talked about. We know there've been shortages in some key sectors, agriculture, hospitality, haulage. I'm old enough to remember when workforce planning was a thing. And we used to do it. We used to look at what different business scenarios, economic scenarios might hit us and look at our supply of labour, our demand for labour, our internal flows and so on. It was a relatively simple mathematical thing to do with a bit of business now thrown in at the top. I just wonder where workforce planning has gone. We're seeing big problems in the NHS because workforce planning is not something that seems to be done very systematically. So I think that's perhaps a skill that we need to rediscover. One thing that definitely has been exacerbated by the pandemic is burnout and moral injury. We're seeing many more examples of people experiencing burnout, which is not really a depressive illness. Burnout is about cynicism, it's about physical and mental exhaustion, it's about fatigue that is not relieved by sleep. And certainly we're seeing many more examples of occupational groups suffering from burnout. I've just finished a small piece of work looking at burnout amongst general practitioners. And moral injury is something that's been happening again a lot in the NHS, where as a nurse or a doctor, you've not been able, for example, to allow a family to come and visit a patient during their last hours. And that goes fundamentally against their training. And that's caused a lot of them to have PTSD and related mental health problems. And that's something we need to watch out for. I've talked a bit about Great Resignation, so I won't dwell too much on that again. And I'm just conscious of the time. Technology next. So, as I said, technology is often identified as a disruptive force, a driver of productivity that's historically accompanied changes in the nature of work and how it's done. And usually with a bit of trepidation. There's, the robots are going to take our job narrative comes back occasionally to hit us. I think it was John Maynard Keynes, one of his lesser known predictions was that we'd all be working 15 hours a week because technology would enable us to liberate us to work and have very high, lots of leisure time and so on. he was wrong about that, obviously. I think that the technology debate can get overtaken by the geeks, who are really, of course, interested in what's in the vanguard of technological development. And of course, that's really sexy and it's interesting and so on. But actually, in the mainstream, doesn't really have as much impact in the short term on the way that real people work as everyone would like to believe. And of course, the technology can affect productivity in really mundane ways. I remember speaking with Peter Salisbury, who was managing director of Marks and Spencer's a few years ago, and he said that for their business, the biggest step change in productivity in retailing was the adoption of the shopping trolley, or Boris Johnson, as Dominic Cummings calls him. Actually, it reminds me of my only non-executive director joke, which I will tell now because you mentioned them. What's the difference between a non-executive director and a shopping trolley? Both have equal capacity for food and drink, but only one has a mind of its own. That's all right. I'm here all week. Luckily not. So here's a few salutary quotations about technology. Actually, the first quote is at the top is Kevin Keegan. That's not about technology, but it is quite a good quote nonetheless. So Nobel Prize winner in 1903, the more important fundamental laws and facts of physical science have all been discovered. And these are so firmly established that the possibility of their being supplanted in consequence of new discoveries is extremely remote. That didn't really stand the test of time. Next one is about the telephone. It has too many shortcomings to be seriously considered as a means of communication. The device is inherently of no value to us. Western Union, whatever happened to them? Rail travel at high speed is not possible because passengers unable to breathe would die of asphyxia. This is my favourite. The chairman of IBM in 1943 said, I think there's a world market for maybe 5 computers. They were the days when a mainframe filled a gymnasium with about the same processing power as my spectacles. And then some sensible reflection at last. The president of the Institute for the Future said, and I think this is true, that we do tend to overestimate the effect of a technology in the short run and underestimate its effect in the long run. And I think that's just worth reflecting on in terms of some of the more excitable commentary around technology and its impact on the world of work. And of course, we see dystopian images of robots and so on. And all that is happening, and it's a great technology. And the challenge is, I suppose, is our ability to harness it and to diffuse it within our organisations in a way that is not so disruptive that it frightens the horses, but also we know from looking back over the last 40 or 50 years of technology in the workplace that unless you're putting as much investment into the human capital dimension, then the technology, no matter how sexy and wonderful it is not going to take hold. And that's something that I sometimes think we fail to learn. So as I say, the journalistic commentary and hyperbole tends to dominate the debate in this area. I think the balance of opinion now amongst futurologists is that technology is like to create more jobs than it destroys. And I think we need to bear that in mind as well. I think technology has a massive capacity to enrich some jobs, particularly if it can remove some of the routine and repeatable tasks in those jobs. And that's not just about manufacturing, it is about some white collar jobs as well. And we need to think about that. And that's about ingenuity in the way we design and embrace these technologies and the way that we embed them into the way we work. It's not the fault of technology usually, it doesn't work in organisations. It's our fault. It's organisational culture. It's our expectations of it and the way that we manage to integrate it with other ways that we do our work. I think there are some examples of technology that are so sexy that they're provider-led. They're being pushed into organisations before organisations are ready to embrace them. I've just finished a short paper looking at the use of apps, particularly those that track our mental health and our mood. and they're taking off massively. There are thousands of them out there. Most of the time when you look at what they offer, they don't really stand up to very much scrutiny. Almost none of them have got an evidence base underpinning them at all. And actually, most of them are downloaded fewer than 5,000 times each. Even though there's a whole bunch of providers pushing out mental health apps. Almost none of them, fewer than 10%, use the lived experience of people living with a mental illness in order to design them. So they're just pumped out there, usually by insurance companies, actually, at the moment. So I think there's some lessons about how we embrace and diffuse technology through our organisations that we need to learn. And therefore, I think it's back to this point about technology failing to deliver in too many circumstances because it's scuppered by poor implementation and cultural barriers. So finally, the COVID accelerator effect. I think that we are seeing some significant and possibly permanent changes. I think the working from home experiment is one that we're still looking at and learning from. I think organisations are still trying to make sense of it all. But we all know managers who said even 5 years ago, flexible working won't work in that job. It's not possible. We can't possibly offer job sharing or working at home for these people because you need to be in the office or you need to be in the workplace. And that's really been turned on its head. Because what it's meant is that organisations, and particularly line managers, as Carrie was saying, need to really get to know how to manage virtual teams, flexible working, people not being in front of you the whole time, and how you manage people in that way, how you manage their needs as individuals for feedback, for example. We found in our work after lockdown study, for example, that introverts have been doing a lot worse working at home than extroverts, which is at one level counterintuitive. But actually, if you're on Zoom or Teams calls the whole day, that's actually completely emotionally exhausting for introverts. They get almost no time to recuperate and replenish their resources. So we need to think about how different types of employee deal with the working at home challenge. We know there's lots of evidence that younger workers have struggled a bit more with their mental health working remotely, partly because living in a shared house or with mum and dad has been a bit more difficult, but also they just do miss the social connectivity of work much more than some of their older colleagues, and of course we all miss that to an extent as well. Also, I think working from home has become a bit politicised, which is unfortunate. Carrie mentioned Chief Executive Goldman Sachs, who called working from home an aberration, which we will correct, I think was the rest of his quote. So we may see how that will work. Also, Sir James Dyson was very cross about working from home. He called people who work from home cocooned and people who work in the office diligent, until it emerged that when he was on Desert Island Discs a few years ago, he was boasting about how when he first developed his overly expensive plastic Hoover, that he did all that work at home, which he didn't like to have that pointed out, unfortunately. Now, it does seem to me that most organisations, as I say, are taking a very sort of grown-up approach to doing this and feeling their way, and it's something that I think they need to be left to do. And I think there's some experiments going on. I think there's a recognition that people need more collaborative space, so it's having an effect on the design of workspaces, which I think is all very sensible. And I suppose the other thing that it's doing is getting people to think about whether or not some certain types of work are more time dependent or location dependent than others. Here's a very oversimplified 4-quadrant model looking at this, but thinking about what types of work need to be done in a particular location, or which don't have to be in a location at all, and those that need to be done at a certain time or are time independent, is a useful way of thinking about it. So you'd put in the right hand quadrant an author, for example, and the left hand quadrant perhaps a hairdresser. But I think what's happening in real organisations is that there's a lot more subtlety than this going on. There's sort of job cataloguing exercises going on. So organisations are thinking not just about what jobs need to be located in an office or in a physical location, but what types of tasks need to be performed physically and collaboratively with other people, and which can be done at home. I think most organisations are doing that sort of analysis at the moment. And you can't probably get the whole workforce of an organisation in one of those quadrants. So thinking about it at role level and at task level is the way to go. And I think that we're seeing a lot more intelligent thinking about that and collaborative ways of edging their way through to new ways of working that are acceptable and giving employees a voice in that whole process. And I think it's an entirely sensible thing to do. Whether or not it all goes back to where we were only 2 years ago remains to be seen, but I think somehow the genie is out of the bottle, and we're going to see some permanent shifts. This is pretty much my last slide, which I could talk about for about an hour, which I won't. But the shifting agenda for HR professionals, I think, is therefore one of the things that we need to grapple with, and this is where we need more evidence and more research and more good case studies of good practice. But how does this new reality affect some conventional, relatively workaday HR processes like performance management, reward, succession planning, recruitment, induction, all those sort of things have actually been transformed a little bit. You know, I've got someone in my organisation who I've never met physically who's left. So I've had to manage both their induction and their exit interview without actually physically meeting them. It's just weird. Ideals, I talked about individual flexible working deals. What is happening to collective bargaining in that context? What are the role of trade unions? Are trade unions being proactive in this area? Are they embracing the new reality, or are they fighting against it? I think probably both are represented amongst the range of trade union views about this, but I think the trade union movement has gone a bit quiet on this, and I'd like to hear a bit more from them. Revisiting our models of motivation and engagement. So, as Carrie said, there's a strong relationship between control, autonomy, discretion in a job and people's productivity and their well-being. And there's a golden triangle there that we're not very good at articulating or exploiting or building upon. Trust, leadership, line management capability is absolutely critical. Chapter 4 in the book says, ask the question, is your manager bad for your health? And actually, in the last section of that chapter, the subheading is, random acts of kindness are allowed. And that's true. And we need to get line managers to embrace that principle. You know, being a nice person and being empathetic is not a sign of weakness as a line manager. Too many of them think it is. We spoke to a manager in a big organisation at the beginning of the pandemic who said, I firmly believe that stress at work is a better driver of productivity than well-being. And that informed his thinking about well-being at work. Now, you could argue that's, you know, postmodern, or it's a Neanderthal view. Do we value outputs more than inputs now? Are we thinking more about what we value about what people perform, how they perform and how we measure it? What have we learned about the dramatic pivoting that many organisations have had to do in terms of their agility and resilience, you know, from making gin to making hand gel? It's proved to themselves that they've managed to transform really quickly, and therefore some of the objections to transforming quickly they've always used in the past have perhaps disappeared, and they've proven to themselves they can turn on a sixpence. Social capital, knowledge-based organisations, that's linked to the social connectivity that people thrive, and the fact that in knowledge-based organisations, knowledge exchange and social capital are forms of competitive advantage that you need to exploit. Involvement and participation, decision making, people are expecting that now, perhaps more than ever before. And then there's a bigger question about HR's role as the sort of moral compass of business. 51% of line managers say in the last year they've been asked to do something they feel ethically uncertain with. And I think there's a question there about whether the HR function is doing as much as it could to play a more ethical stewardship role over all this. So I think the last 2 years have provided some rich opportunities for learning and reflection, and I think we need to think about which of those we need to capture most urgently. And then there's another question about whether we can embrace and benefit from the opportunities that future offers if we fail to upgrade the UK's management capability. And that for me is the biggest impediment to productivity management. And that's always been the case, and it always will be. Thank you.